and then left the hospital an amputee. And so have watched my own experience of being in this world in a different body as someone whose life is very literally and clearly saved by medicine, by healthcare. So those were the big experiences that led me to be interested in medicine and healthcare myself, for personal reasons, obviously. And then sort of decided to lay in the professional front too, to dig into this and make it my life's work. And so off I went and landed finally into hospice and palliative medicine, which is my subspecialty, and really that is the portal for me in healthcare. There's a lot to say about palliative care and what it can be. So for me, the dealing with the subjective experience of illness, how do we human beings come to terms with our vulnerability? How do we love ourselves and each other while losing it all the time?
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
When I first spoke with Dr. B.J. Miller, I felt the weight of his experiences transform into something unexpectedly hopeful. Dr. B.J. Miller is a palliative care physician, and he's also a storyteller of life's hardest truth, a triple amputee who turned personal tragedy into a mission to redefine how we approach suffering, dignity, and mortality. Years ago, I watched B.J. Miller's TED Talk on what really matters at the end of life. I was struck by his bold challenge to healthcare design, how it was built around diseases rather than people. He spoke with a clarity that cut through the clinical detachment of modern medicine, emphasizing that suffering is not just something to be erased, but an important part of being human. He invited us to see death and illness not as failures, but as a natural, even a meaningful parts of life. When my husband Dan Rosenman died suddenly of a heart attack while mountain biking 11 years ago, BJ's word became a lifeline. His reflection on the difference between necessary and unnecessary suffering helped me shift my perspective. Rather than trying to fix my grief, I learned to live alongside it and open my eyes to see the beauty of grief. That's why I invited him here today to share how we might reshape our approach to life's most difficult realities with creativity, presence, and compassion. Known globally for that groundbreaking talk, he co-founded Mettle Health, a telehealth service providing support for patients and caregivers. His journey began with a life-altering accident at Princeton, where he lost 3 limbs, an event that reshaped his understanding of vulnerability and resilience. Through his work here at UCSF, the Zen Hospice Project, and now Mettle Health, he has challenged medicine to prioritize humanity over cure rates, integrating art, spirituality, and raw honesty into care. In this episode, BJ reflects on how his own brush with death informed his philosophy, why caregivers are the unsung heroes of healthcare, and the urgent need to confront our cultural fear of mortality. He shares insight on building a quality of life index and why true healing requires embracing life's impermanence. And here's our conversation. Well, thank you for joining me today, VJ. It's so nice to have you. As I mentioned, I've been following your work for many, many years, and it's like a dream come true for me to have you here.
Thank you, Christine. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to this conversation. I always like to ask our guests in terms of what inspired you to be on this path that you are in.
Well, I think it's probably a convergence of many forces. From my earliest formative days on this planet, I grew up with a mother who had polio and post-polio syndrome. And so I was around disability, chronic illness, healthcare, and how those, and maybe most powerfully evolved, sort of how society uh, deals with these issues. So, and on some level, the answer to your question is really goes back to my family life. And I am very close to my mom. And so it was something, in retrospect, something of a caregiver, although that's certainly not the word we would have chosen back then. But so that early experience has a lot to say about that. And then when I was in college, I joined the ranks of the disabled community myself after uh, an electrical accident on a commuter train, and ended up coming close to death myself, and learned a lot from that experience, and then left the hospital an amputee, and so have watched my own experience of being in this world in a different body, um, and also as someone whose life is very literally and clearly saved by medicine, by healthcare. So those were the big experiences that led me to be interested in medicine and healthcare myself, for personal reasons, obviously. And then sort of decided to lay in the professional front too, to dig into this and make it my life's work. And so off I went, and landed finally into hospice and palliative medicine, which is my subspecialty, and really that is the portal for me in healthcare. There's a lot to say about palliative care and what it can be. And that is so for me, the dealing with the subjective experience of illness. How do we human beings come to terms with our vulnerability? How do we love ourselves and each other while losing it all the time? These kinds of things. And it felt like healthcare, for all those reasons, is a really very rich territory to play around in. So much beauty happening and all sorts of pain, unnecessary pain happening too. It's quite a mix.
Yeah. I think you mentioned about, because when most people think about being a doctor, they're thinking about, you come to see me, you have a disease, here I go to cure you, and then off you go. And I think that's what most people think about healthcare, really. But you're talking about so many different aspects of healthcare. And I feel like there's a lot more that we put in healthcare nowadays, not just beyond curing disease, but I think even taking care of you beyond the hospital wall. What do you think of that role? Is this a good thing, or is that going to add more burden?
Well, I think both. So it's interesting to key off your language, Christine. Yes, we have, in a way, put a lot more into healthcare, into medicine, beyond just the impulse to try to cure something or fix someone. And I would, I would language that slightly differently, that we're not putting those things in per se. They're always here. We're just kind of, you might say, waking up to those other aspects of the puzzle. Or you might say, maybe we always knew they were there, but we thought they were a responsibility of someone else, families, friends, a different system, something other than medicine, which has tried to keep a more narrow definition of its scope for good reason, because otherwise the subject quickly goes from disease and its management to the human condition. That's quite a leap. But for my money, in my worldview, that's a leap that we're overdue making. And so I'm very glad that we're finally waking up to all the other aspects of the lived experience of illness. Now, it also poses a lot of challenges. Doctors aren't really trained in so many aspects of philosophy or spirituality or even communication. And we're certainly not trained to contend with our own vulnerabilities and our own suffering, which ends up being such a robust teacher if we're going to be handling the suffering of others. But that's not found in our education or our training. It's not found in our job descriptions. And this is the opportunity that palliative care has stepped into, stepped into that vacuum and try to reinflate what medicine can offer the world. But to your question, it's really clunky. We're not resourced for it. The education hasn't been there. The training per se hasn't been there to address all these issues. So we either, from where I sit, healthcare has to keep looking itself in the mirror, and we really have to say what we're here to do and what's really not our department. And if we land on something's not our department, say helping people make meaning in their lives, for example, if that's really not in our department, I'll argue with that statement. But then I think at least by the oath we take in healthcare and medicine, we really owe it to each other, ourselves, and our patients to work on behalf of a still larger ecosystem of care and support. So at least we have vetted resources and people and places to hand off to. I'll take it as an open question of where does our job end in medicine? Wherever we decide to put that line, I'm also just saying we have to be cognizant that it's an invented line and it's well worth our time and our patients' time to collaborate with things and forces outside of medicine to round out the picture. We can keep it all in-house or go out of house, but we got to name it and work on the full Megillah one way or another.
You mentioned earlier about, I think I'm with you on that. I think when you think of a person as a holistic, it kind of helped that person to become a healthier human being. I think you mentioned about the meaning of life, the purpose of life. Without it, it caused a lot of other health issue that is bring you a different challenges that I think for a person. And you mentioned earlier about suffering. How do you teach that to the healthcare professional? And suffering, sometimes you don't want to have, I think you mentioned about necessary suffering versus unnecessary suffering. And how do you know that difference? And how do you teach that?
Well, it's a big, juicy question. I mean, the religions are formed around these issues, right? So the good news is there's a lot of history of humans trying to do what you just described. It's just not always been found in the medical purview. But to your question of how would we begin to teach these things? Well, one very quick answer is embrace palliative care. This is part and parcel of what palliative care has set its sights on, is this big enterprise of the human experience of suffering and realizing joy. So a simple answer to your question is get more palliative care. I don't, that's kind of a too easy an answer. I mean, palliative care has its own struggles, but that is an answer. I think another big answer is to is somewhere within the institution to collaborate with spiritual communities, to dig into the philosophical aspects of what we do. Certainly the ethos, the ethics of care is a very rich terrain to learn about these issues. So some of these are already in place, just sort of under-realized, under-resourced, and some need to be developed. And then still another answer to your question, and none of these answers is exclusive of we can do all of these things, and some level we should do all these things. But I was just going to say, one answer to your question is because we doctors, nurses, social workers, chaplains, administrators, because we happen to be human beings ourselves, in some ways it's as simple as us expanding our purview of our care to include ourselves and our whole experience. In this way, our daily lives are our best teacher. Christine, how do you deal with this enterprise of being alive on this planet? How do you learn to love life while losing it? How do you grieve, Dan? How do these questions are for all of us. And if we're paying attention to our own lives, the lessons are right in front of us. Or at least the reason to look, the reason to care, the reason to pay attention. So I think a really good answer to your question gets back to including yourself and ourselves in our purview of care and and tending to our lives so that they can teach us how to tend to others.
I like that. I think also not everybody is have that skills to look at themselves and have their lived experience to teach you. And I learned that going through what I went through. And it's almost that you're kind of doing it based on your own capability and your willingness to learn, but nobody's teaching you. And how do you like train the doctors so that they have that skill set to look at themselves as a school?
Correct. Yes, you're right. And I think, well, one answer is I think we need to revisit, as we do often at UCSF. I'm no longer there, but every few years the whole curriculum would be retooled. So one answer to your question is do we all agree that these issues are important? I mean, you could come at these same issues from trying to push back on burnout or recruitment and retention issues. You could come at these issues in other words, through an HR lens. You could come at these issues through resource allocation. I mean, all sorts of roads lead here. So pick a road. But first, can we agree as an institution or as a department or as a practice or as a total system, do we care about these issues? First of all, do we believe that these issues are important and affect our care? I certainly do. I'd imagine you do one way or another. So back to your question about, okay, well, how are we going to learn? Well, we have to revisit our curricula that includes this larger view of reality. Some of these things can be taught. So that's one answer. Another is we have to take our mentorship very seriously. So those of us who've been around for a while as human beings, we have to be willing to share our experience, our vulnerabilities, our tears, our joys, our lessons. We can demonstrate those. We can model those for younger physicians and clinicians. That's a huge way to do what you're describing. Um, so, and then patients, I think increasingly I'm interested in talking to the public and sort of arming patients with the tools to nudge and question their clinician and push their clinician a little bit beyond the sort of status quo and the sort of standard lines. It's a big one in my field of palliative care, for example. Like, we know that a lot of physicians struggle to be very honest with prognosis with their patients and to really crack open that hard nut and really talk honestly about it. We know that that's a struggle, and we know most physicians actually just don't do it. And the reason they give is almost uniform: is, well, we don't want to take away hope. And on some level, I understand that as a physician. Sitting in these encounter visits, and you don't want to. You don't want to ruin this beloved patient's life in that moment. You don't want to rip down all their feelings. So I get that impulse. But that statement, we don't want to take away hope, has in it such a bloated sense of our responsibility. And it's not my responsibility to give or take hope. In some ways, what we're talking about, Christine, is actually, it's less difficult than the current status of propping up false realities, putting on blinders and crowding out so much of the view just so we can stay true to our little piece of the puzzle. For my money, that's even harder than just letting the guard down and addressing this stuff. So another sort of point here is the status quo is way too difficult and it doesn't work very well. So all two good reasons to revisit how we're functioning. And I believe firmly that if clinicians are encouraged to be full human beings in their work life, that will translate to better patient care. And I also believe that happier patients will make happier clinicians, that there's a real fugue that can happen between doctor and patient, and to allow each party to affect each other and teach each other.
Yeah. And I think create that human connection. Do you think that what you're saying, because they want to not take hope away from the patient, do you think because of your experience, your grief, your suffering that you had, it helped you understand their point of view more rather than being the one who's the authoritative figure, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this happens a lot in the disabled community. This happens a lot among patients who have been around the block, a time or two, to experience this sort of status quo of care, to experience the disillusionment and disappointments and excitements that come with it. It's a real mixed bag. So, Yes, I think a lot of patients um, ultimately find themselves in the teaching role, or at least the forgiving role. I found myself in there. Even though I'm the patient, I'm in the bed, I'm ostensibly the vulnerable one. I know oftentimes I'm talking to a physician who, you know, is on some level is struggling so much more than I am, or differently, because he or she just can't find their place in my own suffering, and they can't find the way to look at themselves honestly, and they can't even look me in the eyes sometimes, etc. I see all those cues, and it's not just me. Anyone who's been around the block will have these experiences where you are left to either you have a little crossroads to either get angry at your doctor for not being more or better or fuller, or deeply feeling for this poor person struggling so hard with an impossible job, seeing dozens of people a day, sitting with suffering, and they keep taking the bait that it's their suffering to somehow fix versus just pull up a seat and attend and be with. It's that simple, and it's that hard. And to your question, I have a lot of compassion for my colleagues who life just hasn't been taken them down to their knees enough to learn these lessons. I find myself with sort of sadistic fantasies that all potential anyone in healthcare, especially clinicians, have something really horrible and hard happen to them. Not that kills them, but that helps rip down the veneers and all the posturing and all the stuff that makes them think they're supposed to know stuff that they can't possibly know. It's something, cause some force come along and just smack that stuff out of the way. It's painful as hell, but there's no educational substitute for it. And unfortunately, in a way, life will eventually do that for most and all of us. So in some ways, we just have to be patient with each other.
Yeah, no, I'm always, it's so funny that you mentioned that. I think 3 years after my husband passed away, I told my friend that his passing has been a gift for me. And it's so funny because I've mentioned that to them. They look at me funny. I said, well, I wish it didn't happen, but it did happen. But having that happen, it gave me a lot of different perspective I would never had. And interesting, after 2 years after I was telling my friend about it, Stephen Colbert was interviewed by Edison Cooper, and he was saying the same thing. And I was like, see, I'm not the only one who's crazy. But again, it's hard for people to understand that when they have not gone through it. I think it's allowed me to think differently in a way. I also become thinking more about how can I help the other person to help me to get out from my pain, rather than trying to make sure that the person can guess what my pain is. And if they don't know it, then it's somehow they're not compassionate. I just become more pragmatic, maybe. I don't know.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. There is a sort of a practical sort of notion to this kind of honesty we're talking about. I'm just being plain. Yeah. I'm in pain. Yeah. Whatever it is, once you de-shame these difficult states and realize they're just normal part of the human enterprise, it's a little easier to be sort of just plain practical about very difficult things.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I want to make sure that I know we can go down on this conversation because I enjoy that topic. But I do want to ask about what you're doing now with Mettle Health and what you're trying to accomplish to this project.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine, for asking. My partner and I, Sonia Dolan, she and I had worked together for a few years. I had moved from full-time clinician to out in the community and doing other things. And I kept my clinic at the cancer center with Mike Rabo and the symptom management service for years while I was sort of out in the world, kind of bumping up against culture and society and how we all handle these issues. Um, and in that, uh, uh, in that process, I learned a lot, including that I was starting to see that healthcare, as amazing as it was, getting increasingly clear on its shortcomings, and we're touching on many of them here. So in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic, Sonia and I decided that our next move was going to be to start what we ended up calling Mettle Health, Mettle, Mettle Health. Um, and it was a pandemic baby, and it was a telemedicine thing. But importantly, we decided to pull it outside of the medical model, outside of healthcare for exactly the reasons we've been talking. I love healthcare, I love medicine, but I don't want to wait for it to right itself. There's too much unaddressed pain happening. So we pulled it out of the medical model. We hung our shingle very quickly as a social service. So I and other experienced clinicians from the palliative care world do the work of counseling patients, caregivers, family members, anyone who comes to us, really focusing on the existential, social, spiritual issues, the things that medicine has said it cares about, but there's just no space. There's no education for them. There's no space for them. So they keep getting crowded off the table. Whereas that's so much of what most of the issues that interest patients and family members tend to fall into this camp, or a lot of them do. So that's what we did. So that's what mental health is. We see patients. Well, I say patients, I should say clients. Again, this is not a medical thing. And most of our clients are actually the caregivers, the family members. Maybe 60% of our clients are the caregivers, which is another reason we pulled it out of the medical model, is because, back in the palliative care clinic, we could attend to the family's needs, but we could only bill for it under the patient per se. So we'd have to kind of Trojan horse the family issues in, and it was always sort of a square peg and round hole. But in our model, being freed up from the limitations of medical structure um, has allowed caregivers to become our patients, and that's been wonderful. Our clients, that's been wonderful. So our model is basically 1 hour at a time, and it's basically set up a safe place for people to come fall apart, and then we can talk our way into rebuilding a person in their with new honesty to their experience, or to get ready to get off the planet if they're at the very end of life. And so that's what Metal is. And Metal, we're now in our fifth year of doing that work online, and that's coming along. We just got a nice investment to help us finally do some marketing work, and as hopefully we'll all be hearing more about and from Metal Health in the coming months. And then meanwhile, given all so that's our direct service, that's the direct care, that's where we're with people. But as we know, there's systems issues all over the place that affect the experience of care. And we want to make sure that to participate in those systems corrections or evolutions. So we're just starting to prop up a nonprofit next to Mental Health that will take on projects aimed at these systems issues, including culture at large. Death phobia, old age phobia, the seduction of a wrinkle-free experience. It's all over our billboards and our messaging. How do we really kind of counterpoint that junk that can so easily lead us astray? So the nonprofit will take on projects like a big resource library, so people aren't left to Google their illness. We're going to look into creating a bricks and mortar site, a place to bring all the issues and the aesthetic and environmental issues to bear. And then we're also going to take on a project see if we can come up with what we'd call a quality of life index, following on that a lot of medical care. And I know I'm going on here. I'll shut up in a second here, Christine. But medicine is filled with people who care. It is people going to great lengths to serve another human being. It's a beautiful thing, but we're also aware that a lot of people can't find their way to practicing all that they want to practice within that system. And patients know this too. We end up, what gets measured is what gets done, right? So if you just follow sort of the root cause of why medicine is the way it is, it's because we do the things that are easy to study. Yes, no, black, white, off, on, these dichotomous variables, quantitative things. These are much more easy to study, and therefore those are the things we study, and therefore those are the things we do. It's not malicious. It's sort of that simple. So one of our bets is that if we can come up with a very functional, validated quality of life index to help upload these qualitative data into the healthcare and medical experience and its policies, then maybe we have a chance to participate in healthcare's evolution. So anyway, those are the the inaugural projects of our nonprofit sister organization that we're just starting now.
That's really interesting and fascinating. It's a huge project, what are you trying to accomplish? And I think one thing that you mentioned about many of your clients are a caregiver, and I'm sure there's a lot more push now towards having care at home. And I always joke that in America, we all become self-service. There's the food, go through McDonald's, you serve yourself. And I think, study shows that when you're getting care at home, you have a better quality of life. I'm not arguing with that, but I think oftentimes the caregiver get the brunt of it and there's no support for it. So I think it's very much needed. And then the part that I think you're mentioning about, this whole, it's easier to teach when it's, yes or no. And I think nowadays with all this social media, the nuances are all disappearing. And how do you teach that? And I like a lot of your not-for-profit project. And I think when I learned a lot when my husband passed away, it's just that this whole culture and society that we live in, think about death is like you win or you lose. And I finally realized, well, nobody's going to win this war. We all lose. But then I remember when he died, I felt this notion that's like, oh my God, I don't want him to lose. The idea of somebody lose is kind of like, because we all want to win. And that's kind of, so in a way, I like what you're trying to accomplish with your not-for-profit is trying to change how we look at death, how we view, because healthcare in this country is so expensive. I think we need to start talking about what is dying as part of healthcare rather than as a separate piece. And how do you think of that in terms of affecting the cost of healthcare?
Yeah, well, you're pointing at some big, big issues that are front and center. What we're, in exactly this is you're pointing right to sort of the core, one of the core issues. Medicine has long viewed death as the enemy. So part of what you're pointing to is also narrative change. How do we come up with different ways of seeing and discussing and naming these experiences? How do we actually get truer what's actually happening? And what's actually happening when we die is not that we lost some game. If just to your point, if you follow that through, then the game was always rigged. We were never going to win. Like, why go to a war that you will lose? Why go to a game that you will like? It starts getting a little silly. And the silliness turns into folly and ultimately into tragedy, because ultimately this isn't a game. This is our lives. And we are left with the residua of the language that we use. So to your point of someone dying, that is plenty hard. You don't need to heap on that pile. In addition, you're a loser. At some point, it's really kind of cruel. And again, that's why I want to kind of get back to root cause of these things in medicine. Medicine is not a malevolent. It's a beautiful enterprise that just loses its way sometimes, accidentally. I don't believe there are many people in medicine who have any interest in causing harm, causing suffering, and yet we do it. So back to your point, death, so as the enemy of traditional medical sort of thinking from the maybe mid 19th century on, it had a conceit in it. And the conceit was, well, if we try hard enough and are smart enough, we'll be able to upend nature one way or another, eradicate disease, and eventually eradicate death, sort of the logical endpoint of that thinking. No, 150 plus years in, I think we have to be honest that like we just were, that doesn't make much sense. Death will always win. It's insists on itself. So maybe we need to reorient to our main and to a different enemy. For my money, if we need a different enemy, it would be unnecessary suffering, the gratuitous stuff that we just cause with our haphazard language or incomplete concepts. That to me is a much better enemy than is death. So, how are we going to do that? Well, we'll keep talking about it like this. Keep being, I mean, the good thing is we have reality on our side. And that's a big friend to have in your corner. And I see it in younger students. People are increasingly interested in hospice and palliative medicine, the field that has taken death on. To live in hospice, death lives in hospice as nothing to be afraid of or avoid, but as something that's coming no matter what we do, and therefore let's work with it. So there's a lot already in medicine to build from, and namely, and again, in the fields of hospice and palliative care, but also in clinical chaplaincy, et cetera. So maybe I've strayed from your question, but I more just kind of confirmed your point that we really, if we reorient our relationship to death and therefore our relationship to nature, by the way, so much will flow if we let it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? Now I'm asking completely speculative, well, not speculative. A lot of the tech bro have this desire that they're going to live to 500 years old. And I always laugh about that. I was like, oh my God, that means you have to do 500 years of laundry. Why do we want to make people live until 500 years? And what's your thought about that?
I think it's just folly. I think it's immature. I also understand it to some degree. We are wired to run away from death too. We're not just, so I want to be careful. In my critique, there is deep in our nervous system, we are wired to be repelled by anything that threatens our existence. So, this is complicated stuff. It's not just an accumulation of social mores that have gummed us up. I'm not advocating that we all go running towards our death. I'm just saying that we be real with it. But anyway, back to these tech bros. I mean, I welcome a debate with these guys any time, because I think where some folks are landing, I think of Peter Attia is a good example of someone who is very serious about longevity, but doesn't make a mistake of moving from living as well as you can for as long as possible to living forever. That leap is insane, and I think causes a lot of damage and is a huge distraction. And is driven ultimately by a lot of fear. If these guys could get right with reality as it is, then their penchant for disrupting nature all the time and causing so much trouble in the doing, I think would ease. So I feel I want to laugh at some of those impulses, and I feel sorry for these tech bros who are laboring in a narrow way under that banner. But I also will be around for it when they get their diagnosis and when they go down and when they realize their vulnerability is not avoidable and in fact is a source of their actual strength and a source of connection to others. We'll be around to catch them when they fall.
Yeah, it is interesting you're saying that is I think history is always have subgroup of people who wants to live forever. The Chinese emperor who wants to live forever. The Egyptians emperor wants to live forever, and they even bring other people to live with them forever. And I almost feel me being analytical and critical maybe is that the fear of losing what they have. And I think like what you're saying is that when you experience a grief, it opened up different part of you that you never thought exists. And it's a beautiful, I never know that it could be beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's hard to explain, and I think you know what I mean.
I do. And it is very hard to explain. And I'm sorry to cut you off. You were saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and of course you don't wish that upon anybody.
No.
But when it happened.
No, I don't wish that upon everyone, but nor do I wish a false reality, nor do I wish a two-dimensional life when they could have three. I wish for a full, my goal, if I had to sort of, a statement would be, I want to learn to love reality and realize my place in creating it. There's something between total control and no control. There's something between action and passive. Again, I think a lot of what you and I are talking about, you and I get what we're talking about. The struggle is really finding the language that does this stuff justice. But to your point, I feel sorry for these tech bros because they're missing out. It's like a flower that doesn't open. It's like a potential unrealized. And again, we don't need to fetishize suffering or loss. No, let's definitely not. But it will come, and when it does, can we be true? And can we sit at its feet and be true to it and learn from it? And you can. If you proactively sort of set out a kind of a pathway to convince yourself that you can deal with grief when it comes, well, maybe there's some use to that. But I'd also say there's just some use to an easier path is just don't pretend to know everything. And when you get there, it'll come and then you'll deal with it, you know? So you no need to, preordain or forecast your misery and start sooner than you need to. It'll come.
Well, I know this is many years ago when the Affordable Care Act was trying to be, implemented. There's a lot of talk about, not the death penalty, what is it? I think, what is the term? The death panels. Do you think the country now is ready to talk more? Because that is something that should be considered when you think about healthcare.
Yeah. I think we need to be serious that death is part of the picture of life that we're treating. And so we have to find a way to bring death into the picture. So we've been talking a little bit about that for sure. Now, whether or not I as a practitioner, I as a patient, I as a family member, et cetera, what I feel about the idea of actually hastening death is a big, big question. So part of what I hear in your question is, the ongoing debate around what some people term the right to die, which is essentially, in the setting of a terminal illness, whether or not individuals have the right to end their own lives, and physicians have the responsibility to participate in hastening that death in the name of mercy or self-realization or harm reduction or something else. But so there is this piece, this very charged philosophical, spiritual question of our role in actually hastening death. It's one thing to get out of the way of death eventually, but to actually seek it is another in society, in law and ethics. So that's one big piece of your question. But just to circle back, that death panel charade, that came right out of Sarah Palin and the progenitors of a current MAGA movement, which took that issue. It was Earl Blumenauer, a representative from Oregon, who's just retiring. But back in 2007 or 8, I can't remember exactly, he simply put forth a piece of legislation that would all it was to pay doctors for a half hour of their time to discuss the patient's wishes for the end of their life. That was it. Do we pay for that doctor's time to have that very important conversation? Of course we should. I mean, it's a ridiculous. Somehow that little law got politicized and turned into this death panel scare, which took the country by storm. It scared the hell out of people and infused a lot of distrust or evinced a lot of distrust that was already there in healthcare and systems in general. And it took the field of palliative care and medicine in general this long to recover. You couldn't even mention the word advanced directive, advanced care planning, which again is simply the act of kind of forecasting how you might want to leave the planet someday. So back to your question. So that's the history. It's insane history, but it's also human history, and the two go together. But here we are. So are we ready now to revisit that conversation? I do believe we are. Even the phrase advanced directive or advanced care planning is more known to people than it was a few years ago. I think more patients realize that that's something they should do. I think we're watching the right to die laws grow, as there are now 10 states plus the District of Columbia, if my math is correct and up to date, that have laws on the books, including California, that it's legal for a physician to prescribe lethal medicine to a patient who wants to hasten their death. So it's coming. It's herky, it's jerky, but I do believe we're in a better place than we were in 2009. And I also believe we got a long way to go still.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's reassuring sometimes to hear, because sometimes the news make it things are going bonker, everything, and knowing that things are moving. I used to tell all my friends that in this country, if you have a lot of resources and means, you can have a baby through IVF. If you want to hasten your death, you can fly to Switzerland. And so that's only reserved for people who have the means and resources. So I think it's good to make that available to more people.
There's a film out right now. You may have seen it. These issues are finding their way to culture. And that's where I think a lot of the action is. You can give a zillion grand rounds conversations on these subjects, but one film can change things in ways that grand round talks cannot. And I would just point you to the movie that's out right now. I think it's called The Room Next Door, or The Last Room. Can't remember. I should have gotten clear on it. It's with Julianne Moore and Tilda Swinton. It's a beautiful movie, but it is all about a friend helping a friend hasten her own death and issues that come up.
You're so right. Movie has so much power. We think you cannot experience everything in one life, and you see through other people's life from movie. And I think there is a good thing as a bad thing. Like I mentioned to you, when I was grieving, I thought it should be like in a movie. It's not like a movie, but there's some truth to it, and many of them are not, I think. But I think it kind of started a conversation and allow you to think differently.
Yes, and I think it's on us as the viewers to draw the distinction between a 2-hour film and the reality it's meant to condense. And you're right. The experience of illness is oftentimes it comes up a lot, and how people die and what CPR means and how often people survive it. I think the public has been taught by fiction on TV a lot. So I do think we have to hold those stories lightly and not confuse them with a full picture of reality, but they can be very wonderful conversation starters, inspirations, excuses to think differently for a couple hours, etc. Yeah.
And I think in the movie, there's a lot of glorification about medicine, ER, a lot of ER movie. And I don't know if there's any palliative care movie out there.
Not that I'm aware of. Not in, there's a documentary that was called Endgame that came out a few years ago that takes place in part at UCSF. So there's some film work out there. Limitless with Chris Hemsworth touches on this issue that was a show on National Geographic. So there are bits and pieces, but there's not been certainly a mainstream blockbuster that deals with palliative care per se. No, not yet.
Not yet. Well, I know I can talk a lot more. And last question, I know you're busy with your Mettle Health and the not-for-profit. What do you think? What are the things that excite you?
It's a big question, my friend. Well, everything we're talking about excites me. I love this job. This crazy job seems like the weird word for it. It's bigger than a job. It's sort of I guess I'm saying I love life and the challenges of it and the wacko human experience that can render me. We are capable of such incredible beauty and in such incredible terror. The human experience remains just plain fascinating to me. So that's one answer to your question. I suppose a more specific answer, Christine, really is I don't need to be coy. I mean, I am a liberal. I would be considered a liberal California guy in the political spectrum, and fine, I am. But I do think whatever, my parents are very conservative. So in my own family, there is a political divide and that we are navigating as we speak. But I know this is a touchy subject, but an honest answer to your question is I am excited and including terrified about our current political climate. And part of what it gets me excited though is it's sort of like it's sort of like a cancer diagnosis or some big diagnosis that comes in, just takes you thought the world was one way, and then something comes along and just says, nope. And it just takes you down to your studs and makes you rethink everything. And while I believe we're in a pretty painful cascade, it's not hard as a palliative care clinician to see that at the tail end, included in that discombobulation, in this sort of coming apart, is an opportunity around the bend to get much more honest with ourselves and to rebuild uh, differently and with a bigger reality in mind. So everything we're talking about right now, as it's playing out within medicine and healthcare, there's a societal and cultural piece. And amidst all that pain, there will also be some rebirth, some rebuilding, some relearning. So I am most interested in our current reality is my answer to your question and all that means, hard and easy.
And like you said, reality is something that you have to face. Mm-hmm. And having that, knowing what the reality is, then it kind of allow you to come up with the right strategy rather than just make up reality for make up strategy.
That's right. And the first order of business is you got to be real with that reality, one way or another, as painful as it may be. The sooner you get the fullest picture in your sights, well, then the sooner you can make peace and make friends with reality rather than be at odds with it. So there's the opportunity. It ain't comfortable, but we're in the middle of it. And if we're going to have to go through all this pain, well, at least we'll get to the other side we'll get to the good stuff too then.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. It's been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it's really nice being with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We hope you found the conversation insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us continue bringing you the latest in health innovation. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn and Twitter for updates on upcoming episodes and more. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in healthcare. I'm Christine Minato, and thank you for listening.